Many years ago, a lady was touring across Europe with some of her friends and went into a little jewelry shop in France and found an exquisite diamond bracelet. The price was $5,000. She wanted to ask her husband's opinion about the purchase, but he was back home in the United States. And since this was the days before texting and email and global cell phones, she went down to the local telegraph office and wired her husband as to whether or not he thought it was a good idea to buy the bracelet. He wired back, no, comma, price too high. The only problem was the telegraph operator left out the comma. And so the message that the wife got was, no price too high. She bought the bracelet. The husband sued the telegraph company and won. Punctuation matters. I really don't care what our current texting and tweeting culture says. Punctuation matters. Incorrect punctuation can entirely change the meaning of a statement. It's the difference between, let's eat, Grandpa, and let's eat, Grandpa. Or how about this sign? Tables are for eating customers only. Or this one, toilet only for disabled, elderly, pregnant children. Now that's a neat trick. I love this Facebook post. Don't wear black people. Then there's this one from the Goodwill store. Thank you, your donation just helped someone. Get a job. Then there's this one. Cows, please close gate. I had no idea that cows could read. And here's my favorite. It's a sign from one of our sister United Church of Christ congregations. Best sausage supper in St. Louis. Come and eat, Pastor Tom Wrestler. Poor, poor Pastor Tom. Punctuation matters. In today's reading from Luke, theology is literally dependent upon punctuation. Does Jesus say to the thief on the cross, I tell you, today you will be with me in paradise? Or does Jesus say this, I tell you today, you will be with me in paradise? There's no punctuation in the original Greek text, so the translator has to supply it in English. Do you believe Jesus was telling the thief he would be joining Jesus that very day in paradise? Or do you believe Jesus was telling the thief he would be joining Jesus at some future day in paradise? It all depends on where you put the comma. And then there's this intriguing little couplet that I came across not long ago. Do not despair, one of the thieves was saved. Do not presume, one of the thieves was damned. Although no one can find it in his writings, it's widely attributed to St. Augustine, but there's no doubt that it's been around for centuries. Yet my question is, how do you punctuate it? Because remember, punctuation can change the meaning of the statement. To my mind, the first sentence is pretty straightforward. Do not despair, period, or semicolon. One of the thieves was saved. It's an obvious reference to the Luke story that was read a moment ago. One of the thieves crucified with Jesus admitted his guilt and proclaimed Jesus innocent, and at this, Jesus offered him salvation wherever he intended the comma to go. Do not despair. After all, even one of the thieves crucified with Jesus was saved. So then why do you think your life is a lost cause? Where did you get the idea there's no hope for you? In the Peanuts comic strip, Charlie Brown is moaning to Linus about his chronic sense of insecurity, how nothing ever turns out right for him, and he says, it all goes back to the beginning, Linus. The moment I was born and stepped on the stage of history, they took one look at me and said, not right for the part. I know that feeling. It was on display for all to see every day on the school playground when it came time to choose the kickball teams. Two captains would take turns picking players, and of course they'd always pick the best players first. And then they'd pull out the mediocre players, and I'd be standing there watching the crowd around me get thinner and thinner and thinner. And then finally, when I was the only one left standing, the two captains would get into an argument over who had to take me. I had him last time, it's your turn. You're not sticking me with him, we'll lose for sure. Well, I'm not taking him, and a fight would ensue until the teacher intervened and made one of them include me. It does wonders for your self-esteem, let me tell you. And the people close to me know that there are days when I still feel like that kid on the kickball field. There are days when I still think I'm the biggest failure on the planet, days when I feel so low I could sit on a cigarette paper and dangle my feet over the side. But the resurrection story tells me I have no reason to despair. Even if I am the biggest screw-up who ever lived, there's still hope. After all, even one of the thieves was saved. There's always hope, even on the other side of a colossal failure. Maybe you recall the story of the little boy named Tim who made a clay ashtray for his dad in his kindergarten class at Christmas time. But on the night of the school Christmas pageant, in his haste to claim the gift that he had worked on so hard and wrapped with such care, he accidentally dropped it and shattered it into a dozen jagged pieces. Well, Tim collapsed to the floor, weeping those huge, heartbreaking tears that only a child can cry. His father, in typical male fashion, said, "Oh, Timmy, don't worry. It's all right. They're there now. Don't cry, son. It's okay. It doesn't matter." But his mother, much wiser in such moments, said to her husband, "Oh, yes, it does matter." And she crumpled to the floor beside her son, cradled him in her arms, and said, "Darling, it's all right to cry. You just cry all you want to." And the two of them together wept in a rocking embrace. And then when both had spent their tears, she pulled a wrinkled tissue from her purse and dried his eyes and dried her eyes. And then after a deep breath, the two of them surveyed the shards and the shattered pieces of the prized ashtray, and she said, "Okay, let's pick up the pieces, take them home, and see what we can do with what we have left." That's the message of Easter, my friends. There's no reason to despair. God will always scoop us up and help us make something wonderful out of whatever we have broken. After all, even one of the thieves was saved. And that brings me to the second half of the couplet I mentioned earlier. Jim, if you could go back to that slide, please. Thank you. Do not presume one of the thieves was damned. Now, most of us would think that that sentence should be punctuated the same way as the one before it. Do not presume, period, or semicolon. Remember, one of the thieves was damned. It would be a warning not to presume on the grace of God. Like an old African-American preacher I heard say, you can't work for General Motors and expect Ford to pay you. There are consequences. So don't assume that God's grace is like a check you can cash whenever you feel like it. After all, one of the thieves was damned. But does the biblical text say that? No, it doesn't. There's no mention of the other thief except to tell us he was begging Jesus to save himself and both along with him. Luke certainly doesn't say he was damned. None of the other New Testament writers say anything about him. So why do we assume that he was cast into the outer darkness where there's weeping and gnashing of teeth? Well, maybe it's because we want life to balance out. We want the righteous to be ushered into paradise and the wicked into perdition. We've been told over and over again that the middle way is always best. Not too far in this direction, not too far in that direction. Everything has to even out, you know? Except that doesn't square with the God we know in Christ. Everything he ever said, everything he ever did upended our notions of what is just and fair. So if despair isn't an option in the face of our own sins, why do we presume that condemnation must be the only option in the face of someone else's sins? Don't despair. After all, one of the thieves was saved, but don't necessarily presume that the other thief was damned. Philip Yancey says it this way: there's nothing you can do to make God love you anymore. And there's nothing you can do to make God love you any less. Yeah, I know. You and I want life to even out on both sides, don't we? That's the model we follow in business. It's the model we follow in government. It's the model we follow in sports. It's the model we follow even in the church. But the empty tomb says that's not the shape of reality. Even though the Romans nailed him to a cross and the crowds cursed him while he hung there dying, Jesus said, "Father, forgive them." Even though his own disciples deserted him on the cross, on Easter, his first words were about a happy reunion with his disciples. You see, folks, while we're so busy dividing the world into saved and damned and us and them and liberal and conservative and friend and foe, God is at work on an entirely different kind of project. God is at work reconciling the world, the whole world, to himself, and reconciling us to each other. So in front of this empty tomb, you and I must surrender all of our assumptions about any person on this planet. We simply cannot presume anything about the depths of God's grace. We cannot presume one of the thieves was damned, nor can we presume that the person who fills you with the most loathing, the most dread, the most anger will be damned either. If grace is grace, it comes to others as much as it comes to you. At a previous church I served, there was a middle school kid in the youth group by the name of Jeff. He wasn't a bad kid, just mischievous. Nah, that's being too charitable. Jeff gave his parents fits. He gave his teachers fits. He gave his Sunday school teachers fits. He gave his pastor fits. I can still see this sort of pursed smile on his lips, like this, that let you know he was up to something. And he usually was. Jeff was the Bart Simpson of the church youth group. When I left that church, I lost contact with him, and unbeknownst to me, his life took a much darker road in his high school and young adult years. Drugs and alcohol were his constant companions. I don't know if he spent time in jail, but I wouldn't be surprised if he had. Well, several years after I had been called on to fuller fields of Christian service, I was invited back to that church to preach at a special service that they were having. It was a great reunion of people I had known and loved, albeit for a short time. And after the service, I was standing at the door greeting everybody, and a young man walked up. He said, "Remember me?" At first, I didn't remember him. But then it all came flooding back. Jeff. Yeah, that was him. At this point, I wasn't privy to the sadness and hopelessness of the intervening years. In my mind, Jeff was still that impish teenager I had known, and I thought, well, this ought to be interesting. So I said, well, Jeff, how are you? What have you been up to lately? And he said, well, I've had some tough times. I was pretty messed up for a while. I was strung out on drugs. My life was really a wreck. But preacher, I want you to know God took care of me, and I'm okay now. And then he gripped my hand, looked me squarely in the eye, and said, and I want to thank you for what you did for me on that youth retreat in Gatlinburg. And then he was out the door. Now, was I surprised Jeff had struggled with addiction? Not in the least. Here's what surprised me. I don't have the foggiest clue what I did for Jeff on that youth retreat in Gatlinburg. Not a clue. Oh, I remember the youth retreat all right. I remember threatening Jeff and some other boy with calling their parents or maybe sending them home in a body bag. But I don't remember any great pearls of wisdom dropped in Jeff's lap that weekend. But it doesn't matter. In the alchemy of God's grace, Jeff was never a lost cause. Just like that thief on the cross was never a lost cause. Just like no one else is ever a lost cause. The empty tomb says so. So do not despair. One of the thieves was saved. And do not presume that the other thief was damned. And most of all, do not forget that God is full of surprises. Amen.